There are stories a civilization tells about women when it wants to hide what it is doing. It calls them warnings, it calls them morals, it calls them protection, but if you follow those stories backward long enough, you find something older underneath them. Fear, then power, then a long political habit of taking whatever feels too alive, too sexual, too sacred, too intelligent, too ungoverned in feminine form, and translating it into danger. Tonight, I want to trace that habit across a very long night of history, from the first cities of Sumer to the segregated order of Jim Crow, America, from goddess and night spirit to doctrine and witch trial to empire, plantation and law, from symbol to stereotype to system. This is not a conspiracy story, and it is not a sentimental story about a perfect ancient world ruined by modern men. It is harder than that. It is a story about how civilizations under pressure learn to assign danger to certain women, purity to others, and then build entire moral orders around the difference. A woman becomes more than a person. She becomes a boundary, a warning, a justification, a body made to carry social panic so that power can call itself necessary. And once that logic joins race, the consequences become even more severe, because then the question is no longer only which woman threatens the household. It becomes which body threatens the nation, which womb threatens the future, which kind of femininity will be protected, and which kind can be exposed, used, or sacrificed without scandal. That is the arc we are walking tonight, not in a straight line. History never moves that cleanly, but in a pattern, a recurring operation, a way of turning myth into common sense into custom, and custom into law. And once you see that pattern, it becomes very difficult to unsee. So let us begin where the archive first starts to glow, in ancient Mesopotamia, where divine femininity had not yet been fully exiled from enormity. Inanna stands at the beginning of this story not because Sumer was a feminist paradise. It was not. But because in those early urban worlds, the feminine could still appear in public symbolic life as something vast, politically charged, erotic, sovereign, and difficult to reduce. That matters, because later demonization often begins not with women who seem weak, but with feminine figures who are too dense with meaning to be safely managed. And somewhere in the long centuries that follow, what is too powerful to simplify becomes too dangerous to trust. Lilith is one of those names that modern culture thinks it knows. To some, she is a feminist icon. To others, she is a demon, Adam's first wife, a symbol of female rebellion punished by religion. To others still, she is simply one more occult silhouette drifting through the margins of the Bible. But the historical record is less tidy than the legend, and that untidiness is part of the point. There is no single moment when Lilith enters history in the form people now recognize. There are older Mesopotamian classes of spirits whose names sound related. There are later Jewish traditions that develop the figure in different directions. There is one famously ambiguous biblical appearance often discussed in connection with her. There are magical bowls, amulets, folk protections, rabbinic comments, medieval elaborations, and much later popular retellings. What people casually call Lilith is actually a layered construction built over centuries from fear, philology, folklore, theology, and imagination. The legend feels ancient because it is assembled from ancient materials, but assembly is not the same as origin, and that distinction matters. Because when we ask how a feminine figure becomes demonic, we are often not looking at a single invention. We are looking at a long process of aggregation. Fragments of danger collect around a name collects around a type collects around a story collects around a moral lesson, and a moral lesson eventually starts to feel like obvious truth. In Mesopotamian materials, scholars have long noted the presence of beings whose names resemble Lilith or related forms, often associated in later interpretation with winds, night, sexuality, illness, or infant harm. The evidence is real, but it is also technically difficult. The ancient world rarely hands us clean categories. Terms shift, languages overlapped, texts survive unevenly. Later readers connect things that earlier communities may not have grouped in exactly the same way. That is why serious history moves carefully here. Still, even when we avoid overclaiming, a pattern begins to emerge. In the old urban imagination of the Near East, the night could be feminized, threat could be feminized, seduction, barrenness, miscarriage, infant death, and sexual vulnerability could be attached to female or female-coded presences that were difficult to domesticate. These figures lived near the edges of the household, the place where society feels most intimate and therefore most fragile. That is important, because the home is where ideology becomes personal. Kings may fear rebellion in public, priests may fear impurity in ritual, but ordinary families fear something more immediate: the baby that does not survive, the pregnancy that fails, the body that falls ill without explanation, the desire that destabilizes the household, the grief that has no visible enemy. In worlds without modern medicine, these fears are not abstractions. They sit on the chest, they haunt the cradle, they enter the room at night, and when fear enters the room, it asks for a shape. That is one of the oldest functions of demonic imagination. It gives contour to catastrophe. It tells frightened people not simply that they suffer, but what sort of being to blame. Not because ancient people were foolish, they were human. All societies reach for images when causes remain obscure. The question is not whether people personify fear. The question is what they choose to personify, and why. In the case of later Lilith traditions, one answer seems clear. The thing feared was not just death, not just sex, not just childbirth, not just disobedience. It was the convergence of these things in a feminine key, a figure who could enter the most vulnerable zone of social life, the family, and expose its inability to guarantee safety. Once a culture decides that vulnerability must have a face, that face can become very useful. In late antique and early medieval Jewish magical practice, for example, incantation bowls and amulets testify to the persistence of anxieties surrounding childbearing infants, nocturnal threat, and demonic interference. These artifacts are not proof of one simple universal belief, but they do show that fear of feminine or feminized demonic attack could be ritualized, named, and managed. Some bowls attempt to bind hostile forces. Some texts invoke angels. Some treat danger almost like a legal problem, something to be warded off through formula, inscription, and authority that tells us something profound. Long before modern political systems, people were already practicing symbolic governance over fear. They were trying to write chaos into a manageable form, and one of the forms available to them was the dangerous woman in the night. Notice the pressure hidden in that image. She is not merely outside. She intrudes. She crosses thresholds. She violates domestic order. She threatens children. She blurs sex and death. She belongs to the hour when rational defenses weaken and inherited stories feel most persuasive. It is hard to invent a more efficient symbol for social panic than that. But symbols rarely stay where they begin. As traditions develop, the dangerous feminine often moves from being one threat among many to becoming a narrative lesson. That is where the famous first wife of Adam motif becomes so revealing. Historically, it is not a straightforward biblical doctrine. It emerges much later through interpretive development and folklore. Yet precisely because it is later, it shows us something about the needs of the communities that told it. Why imagine a woman before Eve? Why imagine that she refused subordinations? Why imagine that her refusal led not simply to departure, but to demonic transformation? Because the story does ideological work. It creates a prehistory for unruly womanhood. It suggests that disobedience is not merely a behavioral problem, but an ontological fracture. It places hierarchy inside the origin story, and then it makes that hierarchy appear not as one social arrangement among others, but as a safeguard against chaos. The woman who will not accept the prescribed order becomes not only difficult, but dangerous. Not only dangerous, but anti-creative, anti-domestic, anti-human. That is how myth launders anxiety into moral inevitability, and we should be careful here. The goal is not to force every strand of the Lilith tradition into one reductive reading. Folklore is wild, traditions mutate. Marginal figures can be feared by one community and reclaimed by another. Modern readers, especially women dissatisfied with inherited religious scripts, have often found in Lilith a language of refusal, autonomy, and the exposed cost of obedience. That reception history is real, but it is downstream from the older process we are tracing tonight, the process by which female non-compliance becomes narratively associated with cosmic threat. That it is a very old move, and once it is available, later cultures can perform it again and again under new names. The Hebrew Bible itself does not give us the rich popular Lilith myth. That is precisely why later expansion matters. A sparse or ambiguous textual trace creates interpretive opportunity. A difficult word, an eerie image, a desert reference, a creature of ruins or night. These can become seeds. Commentators water them. Folklore adorns them. Devotional caution stabilizes them. Eventually, a fully inhabited character steps out of the fog. And when she does, she carries more than textual meaning. She carries cultural desire. In that sense, Lilith is not only a figure in tradition, she is evidence of a method. A civilization confronts ambiguity. It feels pressure around sex, birth, authority, household order, and moral hierarchy. It reaches into textual margins and mythic residues. Then it draws out a woman-shaped warning. This should sound familiar by the time we reach the modern world, because one of the things patriarchal and racial orders share is a reliance on warnings that feel older than argument. Warnings have a special power. They do not have to prove much. They only have to make contamination imaginable. Once people can picture the threat, systems of control feel like common sense. Lilith's later career shows exactly how that works. She is associated with seduction. She is associated with infant death. She is associated with the wild place beyond household safety. She is associated with refusal. Put those elements together and you get a figure perfectly suited for disciplining fear around women's bodies and women's will. And yet there is something else going on here that is easy to miss. The demonized feminine is often parasitic on earlier grandeur. A figure becomes especially potent as an object of fear when she still carries traces of older sacred density. That does not mean Lilith was simply a degraded goddess in any direct linear sense. Serious scholarship is rightly cautious about such claims, but culturally, demonization often works best when it twists something already charged. The threatening woman is more vivid when she seems to possess beauty, voice, allure, mystery, access, and a knowledge not granted by authorized order. The panic attached to her is intensified precisely because she is not empty. She glows, and that glow must be explained away. One strategy is to split feminine power into approved and unapproved forms. The approved feminine becomes obedient, maternal, enclosed, life-giving under supervision, spiritually admirable so long as it serves the structure. The unapproved feminine becomes seductive, excessive, undomesticated, sterile or hyperfertile in the wrong way, verbally dangerous, socially contagious. In time, these categories are not merely descriptive. They become moral destinies. That split did not begin with medieval Europe. You can feel its earlier pressure in the ancient and late antique worlds, but Christianity, in conversation with Jewish scripture, Greco-Roman philosophy, monastic discipline, imperial order, and later legal cultures, would refine the split into one of the most enduring psychological architectures in Western history. Before we reach that refinement, we need to acknowledge something essential. Religions do not only dominate, they also preserve, sublimate, redirect, protect, and comfort. They are not reducible to control systems. The same traditions that produce disciplinary readings can also produce saints, mystics, devotions, ethical revolutions, and languages of profound dignity. The question tonight is not whether religion is secretly evil. The question is how religious symbolism becomes available for governing fear. Nzurha's Nioa claim, but in some ways a sharper one. Because once fear enters theology, theology does not remain merely speculative. It trains attention. It teaches people what to notice in themselves and others. It tells them which impulses require suspicion, which bodies require supervision, which stories count as warnings, and which forms of pain deserve sympathy. That is where demonology becomes social. A child dies, and the night woman is blamed. A man desires, and the dangerous woman is blamed. A household fractures, and ungoverned female speech is blamed. A community feels morally porous, and an impure feminine presence is blamed. Different events, same reflex, and once that reflex has become habitual, it can be attached not only to behavior, but to class, ethnicity, geography, and eventually race. One kind of woman is held up as the guardian of order. Another kind is made to embody appetite, disorder, excess, or contamination. By the time such categories reach modern legal regimes, they feel less like inventions than like descriptions of nature. That is one of history's cruelest achievements. It makes the manufactured feel self-evident. So as we leave Lilith's corridor, hold on to three things. First, the historical record is layered. We should resist easy myths about a single origin. Second, the recurring association of feminine non-compliance, sexuality, and domestic threat is not accidental. It serves social organization. Third, once such associations are installed in imagination, later, institutions can retrieve them in altered form without needing to repeat the original myth. The name may change, the structure remains, and that structure begins to deepen dramatically when the ancient world gives way to late antique and medieval systems in which the body, especially the female body, becomes the site of intensified theological and moral management. The question is no longer only what spirits stalk the night, it is what kind of woman must be produced if Christian civilization is to believe itself clean. If the ancient world handed later traditions a library of female powers, warnings, ambiguities, and household fears, late antiquity and the medieval centuries would do something more systematic with that inheritance. They would not simply repeat the old stories, they would reorganize them inside a larger moral architecture. That architecture was built from many materials at once: Jewish scripture and interpretation, Greek philosophical suspicion toward matter and passion, Roman concern for law, hierarchy, household, order, and public virtue, Christian ascetic ideals, monastic discipline, debates about virginity, marriage, desire, and holiness, the growth of ecclesiastical authority, the management of empire after empire. None of these alone explains what happened. Together they created a world in which the female body became an increasingly charged location for thinking about temptation, purity, social stability, and salvation. What emerged was not one doctrine but a pattern. The feminine was not simply rejected, it was elevated and distrusted at the same time. That is what made the system durable. A culture can openly despise something and provoke resistance. It is often more effective to divide it, to place one feminine form on the altar and another in the dock, to praise womanhood under conditions so narrow that most actual women can be corrected by the praise, to idealize purity so intensely that ordinary female life begins to feel like compromise, to celebrate motherhood while suspecting female appetite, to honor the Holy Virgin while pathologizing the sexually autonomous woman, to enthrone compassion while maintaining structures that interpret women's speech, grief, anger, sensuality, and knowledge through a lens of danger. This is not unique to Christianity, but Christianity in its European and Mediterranean development became one of the great historical theaters in which the split was refined. Eve stands at the center of that refinement. Here we must be careful again. The Genesis text itself is sparse, complex, and capable of multiple readings. It does not mechanically generate every later accusation. Yet later interpretive habits often placed enormous weight on Eve as the portal through which sin, disobedience, and disorder entered the human story. Once that habit hardened, it did more than shape theology. It shaped emotional reflex. Woman could be imagined as morally pivotal in a way that was both exalted and accusatory. She was necessary. She was near origin. She was near the household. She was near reproduction. She was near the education of children, and therefore she was also near blame. What begins as exegesis can become atmosphere, and atmosphere educates people before they know they have been taught. By contrast, Mary offered another pole: obedience, receptivity, purity, maternal sanctity without sexual ambiguity inside the approved frame. Here too nuance matters. Marian devotion has been, for countless believers, a profound source of tenderness, dignity, compassion, artistic vision, and spiritual solace. But socially speaking, idealization can also discipline. A model so radiant can become punitive when set against ordinary women whose bodies bleed, desire, age, labor, bear children under duress, speak too directly, know too much, or simply fail to remain serene under conditions that would crush anyone. The split between blessed and dangerous womanhood did not require that women be hated. It required that womanhood be sorted. Once sorted, it could be governed. One woman is pure because she is enclosed by obedience. Another is suspect because she appears self-directed. One woman is venerated because she gives life without threatening male authority. Another is feared because her sexuality seems to exceed the social script. One woman symbolizes spiritual elevation through renunciation. Another symbolizes flesh, appetite, distraction, and decline. One woman is imagined as intercessor, another as snare. The details vary across region and century, but the deep grammar is familiar. A world anxious about salvation and social order learns to place moral drama on female bodies. In patristic and monastic literature, desire itself is often treated as something that can destabilize the soul. This does not mean men are absent from the moral field. Men too are warned, disciplined, exhorted, and shamed. But the symbolic burden of temptation is frequently feminized. Woman becomes image, test, danger, occasion, reminder of mortality, lure toward flesh, disturbance of contemplation. Even where women are not the direct target of hostility, femininity becomes semiotically available as a language for vulnerability to sin. That matters, because once femininity becomes a symbolic shorthand for disordering desire, actual women encounter a world already primed to interpret them through that metaphor. The metaphor is never only a metaphor for long. This is one reason that apparently small interpretive gestures can have enormous historical afterlives. A sermon emphasizing Eve's role, a treatise praising virginity over marriage, a cautionary tale about female beauty as a trap, a monastic warning about women's speech, a legal assumption about guardianship, a devotional image associating feminine holiness with passivity and silence. None of these alone builds a civilization, but together they shape a culture's intuitions about who must be watched and why. And cultures rarely admit that they are running on intuition. They call it morality. They call it common sense. They call it protection. Protection is one of the most powerful words in the history of control. A woman is restricted for her own protection. A household is regulated for the protection of inheritance. A daughter's mobility is limited for the protection of honor. A sexual code is intensified for the protection of the community. An image of the dangerous feminine is circulated for the protection of the innocent. The language sounds gentle, the structure is not, because protection always raises the hidden question, protected from whom? And very often, the answer arrives wearing a woman's face. If we stand still long enough in this part of the archive, we begin to notice a recurring transfer. Problems that are social, economic, theological, or political are translated into bodily discipline. Human frailty becomes sexualized. Spiritual struggle becomes gendered. Institutional insecurity becomes a moral campaign. The result is that women experience the pressure of systems that were never only about them, but that act through them with special force. Take celibacy and marriage as an example. Christian traditions have never spoken with one voice here, and there are rich positive theologies of marriage as well as virginity. Yet in many ascetic contexts, the renunciation of sexual life becomes a privileged sign of holiness. Once that occurs, women can become simultaneously necessary and dangerous. Necessary because every man has a mother, because households continue through marriage, because widows, nuns, queens, and laywomen shape the social field. Dangerous because sexuality remains bound to anxiety about corruption, distraction, and loss of control. The woman is asked to embody the very thing the system fears. That contradiction breeds endless narrative energy. It produces saints and monsters. It produces penitents and temptresses. It produces holy mothers and devouring seductresses. And between those poles, most actual women live with the impossible task of being pure enough to reassure the structure without becoming powerful enough to threaten it. The split woman is not just a theological image. She is a social technology. This is why demonization cannot be measured only by the presence of explicit demons. Sometimes the most effective demonization happens when no one uses demonic language at all. A woman can be denied agency, credibility, learning, property, sexuality, public authority, legal autonomy, or interpretive voice without anyone calling her a monster. All that is required is a system that treats her as morally volatile and, therefore, in need of supervision. The halo and the cage can work together. That is a hard thing to accept, especially because so many people inherit the halo as sincere devotion, and sincerity is real. People love holy images. They kneel before them, pray through them, find healing through them. The problem is not that devotion is fake. The problem is that symbols can console and constrain at the same time. The symbolic split also deepens class hierarchy. Elite women may sometimes leverage ideals of purity and piety into forms of authority unavailable to poorer women. Aristocratic women, abbesses, noble widows, queens, and patrons can operate in spaces that peasant women, servants, enslaved women, itinerant women, and sex workers cannot. A culture's image of the dangerous feminine often falls heaviest on those least able to defend themselves. That too will matter later when race enters the structure with brutal clarity. Because demonization is rarely evenly distributed. It is selective. One woman's purity is another woman's accusation. One woman's protection is another woman's surveillance. One woman's sanctity is another woman's exclusion. That selective logic was intensified by medieval legal and theological developments surrounding marriage, consent, legitimacy, inheritance, and clerical authority. Again, there is complexity here. Some church laws protected women in ways local custom did not. Some doctrines of consent gave women leverage in marriage disputes. Some convents created spaces of literacy, administration, and learning. History does not move in one direction, but complexity does not erase pattern. The broad trajectory still reveals increasing pressure to define legitimate femininity within institutional terms and to treat unregulated female sexuality as a threat to social and spiritual order. Once legitimacy becomes central, the stakes change. Children must be classifiable. Property must descend predictably. Clerical and noble lineages must be guarded. Sex must be supervised not merely for private virtue, but for public consequence. And because women's reproductive capacity stands near the center of these concerns, women become focal points of legal and symbolic anxiety. This is not because women alone create social instability. It is because systems obsessed with transmission cannot tolerate uncertainty at the site of birth. So female sexuality is interpreted under pressure. Pressure turns complexity into stereotype. Stereotype turns stereotype into policy. Policy turns policy into custom. Custom enters the bones. By the high medieval and early modern periods, Europe had inherited not simply isolated stories about dangerous women, but a thick web of assumptions. Some women could be holy, yes, but holiness usually required renunciation, enclosure, or extraordinary sanction. Ordinary femininity remained morally burdened. Beauty could deceive. Speech could seduce. Knowledge could tempt. Widowhood could unsettle. Midwifery could arouse suspicion. Female sociability could look like gossip, and gossip could become spiritual contamination. Women's bodies were necessary to the social order, but the social order did not trust them. That is the contradiction under almost every later panic, and the contradiction becomes explosive when crisis arrives. Famine, plague, war, heresy, reform, schism, state centralization, economic change, demographic stress. Under such conditions, societies go hunting for causes, enemies, breaches, pollutants. They do not invent their symbols from nothing. They intensify the symbols already available, which means that when Europe entered the age of demonological obsession and witch persecution, the dangerous feminine did not appear out of nowhere. She had been waiting in the archive, not always by that name, not always with one face, but waiting. What followed was not inevitable. It was constructed, yet it was. constructed from material laid down over centuries, the split woman, the suspect body, the spiritualized fear of appetite, the household as a moral border, the community's anxiety about hidden contamination. And once the community learns to imagine female disorder as contagious, secret, and allied with invisible power, repression becomes righteous. That is the threshold we are about to cross. Beyond it, the old fear changes scale. The dangerous woman is no longer merely a warning at the edge of the house. She becomes evidence in court. There is a difference between fearing a dangerous woman and building institutions that know how to process her. That difference is the difference between folklore and procedure. By the late medieval and early modern periods, large parts of Europe had developed exactly that capacity, the ability to take diffuse anxieties about hidden evil and turn them into inquiry, testimony, examination, judgment, and punishment. This was not the work of one book or one church or one state. It was the product of overlapping religious reforms, legal changes, social stress, confessional conflict, local feuds, and demonological imagination. But once assembled, it allowed entire communities to behave as though invisible corruption could be investigated through visible bodies. And those bodies were disproportionately female, not exclusively. Men too were accused and executed for witchcraft, but in many regions, women formed the majority of the accused, and the reasons are not hard to grasp if we have followed the story this far. A society already trained to associate women with temptation, hidden influence, unruly speech, bodily volatility, and household vulnerability does not need much additional pressure to imagine women as the preferred vessels of secret malice, especially older women, especially poor women, especially women living at social edges, especially women whose knowledge is practical rather than credentialed, whose tempers are known, whose neighbors resent them, whose sexuality is uncertain, whose families are weak, whose grief is visible, whose work touches birth, blood, illness, herbs, animals, or death. The witch panic did not fall from heaven. It settled where hierarchy had already thinned protection. That fact alone should make us suspicious of any account that treats witch hunting as mere superstition detached from social structure. The accusations took metaphysical form, yes, but they were distributed through human arrangements. Power decided whose strangeness counted as menace, and the language of the menace is revealing. What is a witch in the full demonological imagination of early modern Europe? Not simply a person who breaks a rule, not simply a woman with folk knowledge. She is someone who participates in hidden inversion. She allies with the anti-order. She makes pacts. She corrupts fertility. She harms infants or livestock. She spoils food. She stirs storms. She withholds nurture. She takes what should give life and twists it. She violates the expected moral shape of femininity and places her embodied existence at the service of a dark counter-society. Listen carefully to the elements of that image: secrecy, sexuality, contagion, counter-authority, attack on household reproduction, moral inversion. These are the same anxieties we have been tracing all along, only now they have been fused into prosecutable identity. The witch is the feminine made legible as treason. This helps explain why the language of witchcraft could become so flexible and so cruel. It was never only about magic. It was about unauthorized female agency under conditions of fear. A woman who knew, a woman who spoke, a woman who cursed, a woman who did not submit correctly, a woman who survived outside the approved protections, a woman who aroused resentment, a woman whose presence made misfortune narratable. One dead cow and a bad winter are not enough by themselves, but a dead cow, a bad winter, a quarrelsome widow, a sermon on Satan, a legal culture willing to hear spectral logic, and a community desperate for explanation. That combination can become a sentence. This is what happens when symbolic suspicion acquires bureaucratic teeth. We should resist the temptation to imagine the witch craze as one long medieval darkness. Its chronology is more complex. Some of the most intense persecutions occurred in the early modern period, in a world already shaped by print, universities, legal sophistications, state formation, and fierce disputes over religious truth. In other words, persecution did not belong only to ignorance. It could flourish amid administration. That is another lesson that will matter later. Systems of control become more dangerous, not less, when they learn to sound rational. The learned demonologists who wrote about witches often believed they were defending Christian civilization from invisible infiltration. They organized fear, they codified rumor, they translated local panic into broader theory. They connected bodily irregularity, sexual disorder, and spiritual rebellion into a coherent threat model. Whether in Catholic or Protestant lands, under different confessional conditions, the general effect was similar. Hidden female danger became thinkable at scale. Again, not every accused person fit the same profile. Not every region acted alike. Not every court believed the same things, but the cultural pattern is unmistakable. The dangerous feminine could now be named, tested, and punished not simply as moral temptation, but as active alliance with evil. That is a leap, and it is worth asking what made the leap so persuasive. Part of the answer lies in the household. The witch is terrifying not because she rules armies, but because she enters ordinary life at its points of dependence. Milk curdles, children sicken, men lose potency, crops fail, animals die, desire wanders, speech turns bitter. The witch's imagined battlefield is domestic and intimate, which means that everyone can imagine being vulnerable to her. Abstract heresy concerns theologians. A child wasting in the cradle concerns everyone. The demonized feminine becomes politically useful precisely because it is local. Another part of the answer lies in reproduction. Birth, miscarriage, nursing, sexual reputation, infertility, widowhood, and maternal failure all carry emotional charge. The more a society depends on stable transmission of life, labor, property, and status, the more it fears anything that seems to interfere with those processes. Women who inhabit the border between life and death, midwives, healers, mourners, wet nurses, caretakers, widows, can therefore become objects of profound ambivalence. They are needed, they know too much, they stand too near what cannot be controlled. Ambivalence is fertile ground for accusation. And then there is speech. One of the recurring features of misogynistic cultures is not simply that women are silenced, but that women's speech is pre-interpreted. When men speak forcefully, they may be read as authoritative. When women speak forcefully, they may be read as shrill, manipulative, disordering, or cursed. In village settings where honor, resentment, favors, and memory intertwine, a woman's sharp word can be retroactively recoded as proof of occult malice. She said this, and then that happened. The logic is absurd by modern standards, but socially it becomes persuasive when the community already believes some women are reservoirs of excess. Menstruation, the witch hunt, thrives on narrative compression. Complex causes are collapsed into a villain. Diffuse suffering is concentrated in a body. Collective anxiety becomes a case becomes moral theater becomes warning, and warning reproduces the system. One of the most chilling aspects of this process is that many people participating in it believed they were defending the vulnerable: children, souls, crops, Christian society. Moral cleanliness, protection, returns again, now with fire in its mouth. The logic is ancient by this point. If danger can be feminized, then coercion can be sanctified. This is why the witch hunt belongs inside the story of the demonized feminine, even when actual accused women had little power and no resemblance to grand mythic figures. The point is not that every persecuted woman was secretly a priestess of some lost goddess. Tradition, that romantic fantasy, erases the specificity of their suffering. The point is that the cultural archive had long trained society to imagine certain women as plausible bearers of hidden corruption. Under strain, that plausibility became lethal, and not only lethal, educational. Witch persecutions teach by display. They teach women the cost of being too visible, too outspoken, too knowledgeable, too solitary, too sexual, too strange, too angry, too independent, too old without family protection, too poor to defend oneself, too useful in the wrong domains, too difficult to classify. They teach communities that social pain can be purified through sacrifice. They teach institutions that fear can be systematized. All of this should sound like more than European religious history, because it is more than that. The witch, as a figure, reveals a technology that modern societies will later adapt in secular terms. The names change, the accusations become medical, legal, racial, or moral, rather than openly demonic, but the underlying move remains recognizable. Identify a contaminating feminine type, tie that type to social breakdown, and authorize surveillance in the name of protection. This is the hinge. The witch is not the end of the old story. She is the bridge. On one side stand ancient fears of female-coded disorder, nocturnal threat, reproductive fragility, seduction, and liminality. On the other side stand modern regimes of classification, in which women, especially non-white women, will be sorted into purity and pollution with enormous legal consequence. In between is the great lesson of early modern Europe, that fear can be made procedural. Once a society learns that lesson, it can apply it far beyond. Witchcraft. A body can become evidence, a rumor can become science, a stereotype can become policy, a myth of contamination can become civic order. And it is precisely at this point that Europe leaves the village and goes to sea. The demonized feminine does not disappear in the age of conquest. It expands. It meets empire, commerce, slavery, conversion, racial classification, and the violent remaking of the world. What had once been a warning about the unruly woman inside the household now becomes a script for judging entire populations. The question widens. Not only what kind of woman threatens the home, what kind of woman threatens civilization itself. When Europe crossed the ocean and turned conquest into world order, it did not leave its symbolic baggage behind. It exported it. This is one of the most important transitions in the story, because colonialism does not merely seize land and labor. It classifies humanity. It ranks bodies. It reorganizes kinship. It polices sexuality. It names some customs civilized and others savage. It converts difference into hierarchy. And when it does this, gender is never secondary. Gender is one of the primary theaters in which empire explains itself. Why? Because if an empire wishes to justify domination, it must do more than claim military superiority. It must narrate the conquered as morally deficient, socially disordered, spiritually immature, or dangerously sensual. The condition of women becomes one of the most available proofs in that narrative. Colonizers point to marriage customs, dress, labor, roles, sexual practices, religious rituals, motherhood patterns, female authority structures, or women's public visibility and say, here is the evidence that these people cannot govern themselves. The move is elegant in its brutality. A conquering society can describe itself as the rescuer of women while using women's bodies to consolidate rule. This happened in many forms across empires. Spanish, Portuguese, British, French, Dutch. Each operated differently, each in dialogue with local conditions, indigenous systems, and economic aims. But across these differences we can see a shared habit. Colonized gender worlds were treated not simply as different, but as signs of civilizational rank. If women in a society appeared too sexually visible, too ritually powerful, too economically active, too politically present, too little enclosed, or conversely too vulnerable in ways empire could dramatize, that condition became evidence. The colonizers' own norms then appeared, not contingent, but universal. This is where the demonization of the feminine joins the imperial gaze. The feminine in colonized populations could now be read through two opposite but reinforcing lenses. On one hand, indigenous or non-European women could be portrayed as degraded victims in need of rescue, proof that their men and cultures were barbaric. On the other hand, they could be portrayed as dangerously available, seductive, excessive, pagan, impure, or contaminating, proof that proximity to them threatened European moral and racial integrity, victim and temptress, backward and alluring, debased and dangerous. Once again, the feminine is split, and once again the split serves power. The colonial household becomes a key stage for this drama. Marriage, concubinage, conversion, mixed unions, inheritance, baptism, legitimacy, and sexual access are not private side issues of empire. They are central mechanisms by which empire reproduces itself. Who may marry whom, which children inherit, which unions are recognized, which mothers confer status, which women can be used sexually without social equality following from that use, which women are imagined as respectable enough to anchor the settler household, which women are cast as permanently outside honorable womanhood. These are administrative questions disguised as moral questions, and as always, morality provides the emotional cover. Mena biua nafantum, when colonizers condemned local goddesses, female ritual specialists, healers, priestesses, or women-centered forms of sacred practice, they were not only debating theology, they were also stripping colonized communities of symbolic worlds in which feminine power might possess authority outside the colonizers' categories. The old sacred, feminine, already reshaped, fractured, and contested in many societies, could now be redescribed as superstition, witchcraft, idolatry, sensual corruption, or devilry. Conversion did not merely substitute one set of beliefs for another. It frequently reclassified whole sensory and moral worlds. What had been sacred became suspect. What had been communal became illicit. What had been complex became primitive. What had been a woman's role in ritual or healing became evidence of backwardness. And once again we should avoid romantic fantasy. Not every indigenous or African or Asian tradition treated women well. Not every pre-colonial practice was liberatory. Some were harsh, hierarchical, violent, or profoundly unequal. But empire thrives when it presents itself as the singular source of order, while refusing to see how its own categories produce fresh domination. That refusal is part of the machinery. The colonizer's woman becomes symbol as well. European and Euro-American ideals of respectable femininity acquire new strategic value in colonial nationality settings. The white woman can be imagined as bearer of home, virtue, Christianity, softness, refinement, domestic morality, and civilizational boundary. Her body and reputation become investments. To protect her is to protect the colony's moral self-image. To distinguish her from local women is to distinguish civilization from savagery. Thus, femininity is racialized from both directions at once. One type of woman embodies order, another embodies the very disorder that justifies rule. This is not abstract. It affects law, labor, housing, education, missionary policy, sexual regulation, and violence. Consider the problem of mixture. Empires often depend materially on intimacy across lines they publicly condemn. Settler men exploit colonized women. Administrations tolerate certain unions when convenient and police them when threatening. Categories of legitimacy shift. Children of mixed ancestry must be placed somewhere. Property and status require rules. The colonial state therefore becomes obsessed with classification, not despite sexuality, but because of it. The womb becomes a political frontier. That phrase may sound dramatic. It is also precise. A frontier is not only a line on a map, it is a zone where sovereignty is tested, categories are enforced, and violence is normalized as administration. When racial order is at stake, women's reproductive lives become frontier territory. Who bears children with whom is not a merely private matter. It is the future of hierarchy written in flesh. Once we see this, the connection between old purity anxieties and modern racial regimes becomes much clearer. The ancient household feared uncertain paternity, seduction, contamination, and nighttime threat. The colonial state fears miscegenation, blurred descent, unauthorized unions, illegitimate inheritance, and racial ambiguity. The scale has changed. The logic has not disappeared. A woman is still treated as a boundary problem. Only now the boundary is imperial. Colonial literature and missionary writing often encode this logic with remarkable consistency. Native women may appear as erotic temptation, as degraded souls needing uplift, as superstitious caretakers of dangerous customs, as unfit mothers, as laboring bodies without proper domesticity, or as tragic evidence that colonized men lack civilized restraint. African-descended women in slave societies will later be pressed into even harsher representational boxes. But already the frame is set. Non-white femininity exists to be judged, used, managed, or redeemed by an order that names itself superior. That order often speaks in paternal tones. We will protect, we will educate, we will elevate, we will discipline, we will rescue. And because the language of rescue sounds moral, empire can conceal from itself the violence of possession. This is why it is not enough to study colonialism only in terms of trade, war, and governance. We have to study it as an emotional and symbolic system. Empires do not only conquer territory, they narrate desire, they narrate purity, they narrate which women are marriageable, which are serviceable, which are dangerous, which are redeemable, which can symbolize the nation, and which must remain outside its protected core. The protected core is always selective. White men are taught entitlement under the sign of stewardship. White women are taught vulnerability under the sign of virtue. Colonized men are taught humiliation under the sign of backwardness. Colonized women are taught that their bodies are readable before they speak. This emotional distribution is one of empire's most enduring achievements. Even after legal codes shift, the feelings remain available. There is also a theological layer here that should not be ignored. Christian universalism, at its best, contains a radical claim about the equal value of souls. In practice, colonial Christianities often struggled to honor that claim when confronted with race, property, and domination. The result was not simple hypocrisy, though hypocrisy was abundant. It was a series of accommodations in which spiritual equality could be preached while earthly hierarchy was intensified. Women of the colonized world might be converted without being socially equal. Their souls could be claimed while their bodies remained administratively suspect. That split is devastating. It tells a person she is fully human before God and permanently less worthy in the world arranged by God's supposed representatives. Again, the halo and the cage work together. By now, the old demonological language is not always necessary. A woman need not be called a witch or demon to occupy the same structural position. She need only be read as morally risky, bodily unregulated, sexually destabilizing, culturally contaminating, or unfit for the protected interior where full personhood is recognized. This is the beginning of modern racialized femininity, not in the sense that race was invented all at once in a single colony or legal code. Race, like gender order, is historically assembled, but the colonial world intensifies the fusion between sexual governance and civilizational hierarchy. It creates conditions in which femininity itself becomes differently distributed across races. White femininity will increasingly be idealized as fragile, pure, domestic, and worth defending. Non-white femininity will increasingly be coded as available, excessive, polluted, laboring, or insufficiently womanly by the standards that now define civilization. Those standards are not neutral. They are built to protect one social order while pathologizing others, and this has a profound effect on memory. Once white womanhood becomes the emblem of moral civilization, earlier complex histories of female power, sacred multiplicity, and social ambiguity are pushed further into shadow. The only feminine the dominant order truly trusts is the feminine it has already disciplined into service. All else may be aestheticized, eroticized, exoticized, or feared, but not allowed to define the center. This is why the title of our journey matters so much. We are not simply watching the divine feminine disappear. We are watching the sacred complexity once associated with feminine power get steadily rearranged into categories that empire can use. Some elements are sanctified, but only inside obedience. Some are demonized outright, some are racialized, some are appropriated and emptied. Some survive in folklore, in resistance, in hidden devotions, in domestic ritual, in memory, in songs, in the stubborn fact that people continue to feel that something holy was lost when womanhood was reduced to policy. But policy is where the story is going, because in the Atlantic world, the racial state will take these symbolic distinctions and sharpen them into one of the most brutal representational systems in modern history. There, under slavery and its afterlives, the dangerous feminine will no longer be an abstract category applied unevenly. It will be color-coded. Myths of Empyreum embodied the old symbolic split. Slavery in the Atlantic world radicalized it. Myths, here the demonization of the feminine becomes inseparable from economics. Bodies are property. Reproduction is capital. Labor is extracted under force. Sexual access is coerced under law or under the shelter of law. Kinship is fractured for profit. Motherhood is exploited but not honored. Womanhood itself is divided by race so thoroughly that the word woman no longer means the same thing on opposite sides of the color line. This is one of the decisive transformations in the history we are tracing. Under slavery, white womanhood and black womanhood are not merely socially unequal. They are symbolically engineered to perform different civilizational functions. White womanhood is increasingly idealized as delicate, pure, domestic, respectable, and in need of protection. Black womanhood is increasingly coded as laboring, accessible, excessive, resilient in the wrong way, unprotected by design, and open to use. This is not a side effect, it is structural. A slave society cannot sustain itself by violence alone. Violence is essential, but not enough. It also requires stories that make the violence seem natural, necessary, regrettable, or invisible. In the case of enslaved women, these stories had to solve a contradiction. Enslaved women were expected to labor hard, bear children, absorb sexual exploitation, nurture others, and survive conditions that would have shattered the sentimental ideal of womanhood if that ideal had applied to them. So the ideal was selectively withdrawn. That withdrawal is a form of demonization, even when it does not speak in supernatural language, because to deny a population full femininity while still using the female body for labor and reproduction is to place that population outside the protective moral circle that womanhood is supposed to guarantee. The circle tightens around whiteness. Everyone else becomes available. In the plantation world, black women were subjected to overlapping fictions designed to rationalize exploitation. One of the most enduring portrayed them as inherently sexual, always already available, naturally impure, or complicit in the very violence done to them. Later Americans would give this logic iconic names and stereotypes, but the underlying operation is clear enough without naming them all at once. If a woman can be imagined as less innocent, then her violation produces less scandal. If she is imagined as excessive by nature, then coercion can be disguised as appetite. If she is imagined as physically strong and emotionally coarse, then the denial of tenderness can appear realistic rather than cruel. This is how a society murders empathy before it commits the act, by interpretation. By repeating the same image until feeling follows the image. The contrast with white femininity is crucial. The ideal white woman in the 19th century Anglo-American imagination is often represented as fragile, moral, domestic, pious, and sexually guarded. Whether real white women lived up to that ideal is beside the point. Ideals are not descriptions, they are maps of value. The ideal matters because it anchors legal and emotional protection. It tells courts, newspapers, preachers, lawmakers, and vigilantes whose vulnerability counts as civilization's own vulnerability. If white womanhood is sacred, then any alleged threat to it can mobilize the full force of public feeling. If black womanhood is denied sacredness, then its actual suffering can be normalized. This asymmetry is one of slavery's deepest inventions, and it does not die with slavery. Consider reproduction. In a slave society where status follows the condition of the mother, black women's childbearing becomes economically consequential to slaveholders. The female body becomes not only laboring property but reproductive machinery for the perpetuation of property. There is no cleaner demonstration of how far the sacred can be inverted by power. The maternal body, so exalted in sentimental white discourse, becomes under slavery a site of extraction. The child is not simply a child. The child is an asset. The mother is not simply a mother. She is a producer under coercion. And then the same society dares to lecture about morality. That hypocrisy is not incidental. It is part of the structure's emotional self-defense. Slave societies must imagine themselves honorable even as they routinely violate their own stated standards. One way they do this is by reserving moral language for selected bodies. Chastity, domestic purity, female protection, and sacred motherhood are narrated as white goods. Black women can nurse white children, raise households, labor in fields, endure sale, and survive assault, yet still be denied the symbolic recognition that would make those violations intolerable in the dominant imagination. This is not merely sexism plus racism added together, it is the production of a specifically racialized femininity, a different category of woman, or more precisely, a category designed so that woman can remain innocent in the abstract, while certain women are stripped of its protections in practice. Once again, the system depends on split imagery. Some black women are represented as sexually dangerous, others as endlessly nurturing but desexualized in ways that make service seem natural, others as physically indestructible, others as breeding stock, others as loud, excessive, unrefined, and therefore blameworthy. These stereotypes differ in tone, but they converge in effect. They deny black women access to the cultural status of protected femininity, and because status influences law, medicine, policing, and everyday interaction, the effects are enormous. An enslaved woman's cry need not sound like innocence if the culture has already translated her body into a different moral language. That is the crime beneath the crime. Not only the violence itself, but the preparation of perception that makes the violence easier to ignore. Notice how closely this resembles the older operations we have been tracing. Female sexuality becomes threat when attached to the wrong body. Reproduction becomes a social panic when it threatens hierarchy. Nurture is honored when it serves the center and exploited when it comes from the margin. Moral purity is not a universal standard, but a political resource. The dangerous feminine is no longer merely the woman who refuses obedience. It is also the woman whose very existence unsettles racial boundaries or exposes the hypocrisy of those boundaries. This is where the mythology of the fallen or impure woman converges with the mythology of racial difference. Black women need not actually transgress white sexual norms to be treated as transgressive. Their bodies can be coded in advance. The accusation precedes the act. In some cases, the accusation becomes the justification for predation itself. If the victim is already morally suspect, then the perpetrator remains, in his own mind or in the public mind, less monstrous. That is what stereotypes are for. They are alibis distributed at scale, and slavery trained America in their use. This training reached far beyond the plantation. It shaped medicine, where pseudo-scientific theories about black bodies could deny pain, justify reproductive abuse, or cast black women as biologically different in ways that legitimated harsh treatment. It shaped law, where enslaved women had virtually no recourse against sexual coercion by those who owned or controlled them. It shaped religion, where biblical language could be recruited both to resist slavery and to rationalize it. It shaped domestic ideology, where the white home became morally luminous partly because so much black female labor disappeared behind its curtains. That last point deserves to be lingered over. A society's ideal of pure domestic womanhood is often built on hidden labor, meals cooked by other women, children nursed by other women, laundry done by other women, sick bodies tended by other women, sexual danger displaced onto other women. The angel in the house is easiest to imagine when another woman carries the ashes out the back. This is true in more than one society, but in the American slave South, it acquired terrifying clarity. White femininity could become a shrine because black femininity was made available as infrastructure. And infrastructure, by definition, is something the dominant order depends on while refusing to truly see. We should also refuse the simplification that enslaved women were merely acted upon. They resisted in countless ways, through memory, kinship, religion, sabotage, healing, mothering under impossible conditions, fugitivity, testimony, mutual aid, legal petitions when possible, and the sheer insistence on personhood in a system built to deny it. But resistance itself reveals the depth of the structure it confronts. One does not resist what has not already tried to define one out of humanity. The symbolic field of slavery also affects black men, of course. Racial terror targets whole communities, but the role assigned to white womanhood inside that field is distinct and fateful. White women become both symbols and, sometimes, active participants in maintaining the social order. Their purity is not merely private virtue, it is a public asset. It becomes one of the emotional pillars of white supremacy. This has a terrible implication. If white womanhood is the sanctified center, then any system that claims to defend it can mobilize extraordinary power. It can police movement, it can justify violence, it can define citizenship through access to its protections. It can cast racial hierarchy as moral necessity rather than naked domination. That logic will reach a fever pitch in Jim Crow. But even before that, the post-emancipation struggle reveals how deeply the old stories persist. The end of legal slavery does not dissolve the representational order that slavery built. On the contrary, freedom intensifies the panic. If black women are no longer property, then they become something even more threatening to a white supremacist society. Autonomous persons whose mobility, sexuality, motherhood, labor, testimony, and civic claims can no longer be managed through direct ownership. At that point, the stereotypes have to work harder. The old plantation scripts are adapted to a new legal landscape. White womanhood remains the moral centerpiece. Black womanhood remains overread, underprotected, and available for blame. The state, the press, the courts, and the mob will all help maintain this arrangement. And because the arrangement now belongs to a nation that claims liberty as its self-image, it must conceal itself in elevated language. Order, if strengthened, order, decency, protection, public morals, the safety of our women. We have heard these words before. Only now they are fused to race with almost surgical precision. The result is not simply prejudice, it is a civil theology. A faith that social hierarchy reflects moral truth, a faith that purity belongs to whiteness, a faith that black female bodies can be used, judged, or ignored without the moral universe collapsing. A faith that calls itself civilization. To understand Jim Crow, we have to understand that it did not begin with a train car or a statute book. It began much earlier, in the long education of feeling by which a nation learned to assign innocence and danger to different kinds of women. Once that lesson had been learned, the rest could be written into law. By the time we arrive in the Jim Crow South, the story no longer needs demons. It has sheriffs, it has legislatures, it has train compartments and schoolhouses and county courts and newspaper headlines and segregated waiting rooms and whispered rules and mobs that believe themselves righteous. But if we listen closely, the emotional grammar is still ancient. Danger must be assigned, purity must be protected, order must be made sacred. And one of the surest ways to make order feel sacred is to tie it to womanhood. Jim Crow is often described, correctly, as a regime of racial segregation enforced through state and local law, custom, intimidation, disenfranchisement, and violence. But if we stop at that description, we miss the moral theater that made it durable. Jim Crow was not only a set of rules about space, it was a disciplined imagination about contact, about who could sit where, study where, eat where, marry where, vote where, travel where, testify how, and touch whom under what social meaning. In that sense, it was a regime of purity in all but name, and like older purity regimes, it depended on gendered symbolism. White womanhood stood near the center of its public moral drama. This did not mean that white women controlled the entire system. Men dominated legislatures, courts, police power, and much of public violence. But white femininity was one of the legitimating icons of the order. The white woman could be invoked as the vulnerable treasure of civilization, the domestic soul of the South, the body whose violation would stand for racial collapse. Once she occupied that symbolic position, nearly any act of racial terror could be narrated as preventive. That is the hideous genius of purity politics. It makes aggression look defensive. Lynching rhetoric in the United States offers one of the starkest examples. The myth of the black male threat to white womanhood became a central justification for vigilante brutality. even though the actual landscape of sexual violence in the South was shaped not only, or even primarily, by that mythic script. White men had long exercised coercive power over black women with relative impunity, but the public imagination did not organize itself around protecting black women from white predation. It organized itself around protecting white women from black proximity. Again, innocence is assigned Vidino. Again, vulnerability is racialized. Again, a society tells the truth about what it values by whose pain it treats as civilization's pain. This is where the demonization of black womanhood becomes especially devastating, because the same moral order that sacralizes white womanhood leaves black women exposed on multiple fronts. They are not only insufficiently protected from sexual violence, they are also overburdened with stereotypes that make their suffering harder to hear, their motherhood easier to judge, their labor easier to exploit, and their presence easier to regulate. If white womanhood symbolizes purity, black womanhood is forced into relation to impurity, whether or not any actual act justifies the charge. The accusation is atmospheric. It floats ahead of evidence. Under Jim Crow, segregation law itself did not always speak in overtly sexual language, but the system's emotional life was saturated with sexual panic. Anti-miscegenation laws, customs policing interracial contact, public transportation segregation, school segregation, residential separation, and ritualized etiquette all work together to maintain not only racial hierarchy, but moral distance. The aim was not simply to keep people apart physically. It was to keep hierarchy feeling natural, intimate, and inherited. When people cannot share a table, they soon forget they share a world. That forgetting is politically useful. It turns inequality into atmosphere, and atmosphere, once again, educates before argument begins. Black women bore unique pressures inside this system. Their bodies were read through the residue of slavery and the demands of segregation at once. They were expected to serve white households while remaining outside white respectability. They could be intimate enough to clean nurseries, cook meals, nurse children, and move through domestic interiors, yet never intimate enough to belong to the moral protections those interiors symbolized. This is one of the most revealing contradictions in the entire history of American race. The white home depended on black female labor, while pretending black womanhood was socially alien to the sanctity of the home. Need and contempt, side by side. Dependence and disgust, side by side. Domestic proximity and civic exclusion, side by side. That is not a contradiction the system failed to notice. It is a contradiction the system learned to manage. The management relied on etiquette, law, humiliation, and narrative. A black woman might be trusted with a white child and distrusted as a full woman. She might be relied upon as caregiver and denied the cultural tenderness associated with caregiving. She might be expected to show difference in every gesture while absorbing indignities that no rhetoric of ladyhood would ever permit against the wrong body. Her labor entered the white moral world. Her person did not. This is what happens when femininity is racialized into separate castes. The South had a name, implicit if not always formalized, for the gendered burden placed on black women under segregation. Scholars later called parts of this system Jane Crow, not because it replaced Jim Crow, but because it reveals the specifically gendered dimensions of racial subordination. Black women faced exclusion in labor, transit, public space, education, political life, and legal recognition, while also carrying expectations tied to domestic work, respectability, sexual suspicion, and family survival. Their oppression was not incidental to the racial order. It was one of the ways the racial order reproduced itself. And yet even here, the story refuses simplicity. Black women were not only targets, they were also architects of resistance. Church women, teachers, club women, domestic workers, mothers, organizers, anti-lynching activists, journalists, petitioners, strategists, and everyday survivors. They contested the entire emotional economy of white supremacy. They challenged the lie that purity belonged to whiteness alone. They exposed the hypocrisy of white sexual politics. They defended black families against legal and economic predation. They built mutual aid networks, schools, campaigns, and moral counterpublics that insisted on a different accounting of human worth. Their resistance matters especially because it shows what the system feared. Not simply black presence, black credibility, black womanhood as authoritative witness, black motherhood as morally central, black female intellect as public force, black respectability on its own terms, not as petition but as declaration. A white supremacist order can absorb labor more easily than it can absorb rival moral authority. That is why black women who spoke, wrote, organized, and accused the nation of hypocrisy were so dangerous to the structure. They were not dangerous in the sense the structure claimed. They were dangerous because they named what the structure was doing, and naming is always a threat to mythology. Take the politics of sexual violence. White supremacy depended on a double concealment, the inflation of black male threat to white women, and the minimization or normalization of white violence against black women. Anti-lynching activism exposed this with painful clarity. Once, the halo around white purity was shown to function as a political weapon, rather than a neutral truth. The moral grammar of segregation began to crack. Not immediately, not cleanly, but the crack mattered, because the system had always counted on being mistaken for morality. What makes Jim Crow so important in our larger story is that it demonstrates the full maturation of the pattern we have been tracing from the ancient world. First, a society locates instability in marked bodies. Then it surrounds those bodies with stories. Then it translates the stories into etiquette and law. Then it teaches each generation to mistake the arrangement for nature. This is exactly what happened in the racial politics of femininity in the South. White women were cast as the protected center of civilization. Black women were cast outside that center, where labor, suspicion, and exploitation could be normalized. Neither category described full reality. Both were ideological productions, but because they were attached to ritual, law, and daily life, they felt real. That feeling is what makes systems last. People obey more than statutes. They obey atmospheres. They obey the glance that teaches shame. They obey the seating chart that teaches rank. They obey the joke that teaches contaminations. They obey the warning that teaches fear. They obey the myth that teaches who counts as a lady and who does not. And because children absorb these lessons early, society can reproduce its cruelty without naming it each morning. There is another reason Jim Crow belongs at the end of this long arc. It reveals how the demonization of the feminine can eventually operate, without explicit reference to femininity at all. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Americans could invoke public decency, social order, race pride, hygiene, or legal custom while carrying forward assumptions rooted in much older divisions between pure and impure womanhood. The old categories were secularized. They entered sociology, policing, education, housing, medicine, and popular culture. They no longer needed devils, they had institutions. That is often how modernity works. It does not abolish ancient fears. It files them, it stamps them, it teaches them to wear a suit. By then, what once might have sounded like superstition can reappear as policy analysis. What once belonged to folklore can return as journalistic common sense. What once burned in sermons can cool into bureaucratic language. But the body still pays the price, and the body that pays the price most consistently is the one the system has taught itself not to see as sacred. This is why the journey from ancient Sumer to Jim Crow is not a simple tale of decline from goddess worship to segregation. History is more jagged than that, but it is absolutely a tale of narrowing, a tale of repeated reductions in which feminine complexity is first split, then moralized, then racialized, then governed. A tale in which one lineage of womanhood is exalted by confining it, while another is degraded by exposing it. A tale in which the sacred is monopolized by power and then used to bless hierarchy. By the height of Jim Crow, the process is nearly complete. The old knight figures have become social categories. The household warnings have become civic law. The purity story has become public order, and the nation, looking at what it has made, calls it tradition. If the story ended with Jim Crow statutes, it would still be devastating. But the deeper wound is that systems do not only govern from outside, they train the inside. They settle into instinct, gesture, voice, fear, aspiration, desire, shame, and memory. They teach people to police themselves according to standards they did not invent. They teach communities to distribute tenderness unequally and call the arrangement natural. They teach women to ask, often before they say a word, what kind of woman they are being seen as. They teach men what kind of woman can be ignored, pursued, protected, punished, joked about, or listened to. They teach children who looks safe, who looks fallen, who looks respectable, who looks dangerous, who looks like the future, and who looks like the threat to it. This is the stage of the process most people miss. The law can be repealed while the feeling survives. The sermon can fade while the reflex remains. The statute can be struck down while the gaze keeps working. And because the gaze feels ordinary, it is often the last thing to be challenged. What we inherit, in other words, is not only history. We inherit trained perception. That inheritance can take many forms. A church that speaks gently of women while still rewarding obedience over authority. A school that treats black girls as older, louder, less innocent, less in need of protection than white girls of the same age. A courtroom that hears vulnerability differently depending on the speaker's body. A workplace that interprets assertiveness as leadership in one woman and threat in another. A media culture that continues to split womanhood into the worthy and the disposable, the pure and the suspect, the maternal and the excessive, the aesthetic and the vulgar. We like to think we have outgrown myth. Usually we have only privatized it. The old figures survive not as explicit demons, but as expectations. A woman should be attractive, but not too conscious of power. She should be strong, but not in a way that unsettles hierarchy. She should nurture, but not demand moral centrality for that labor. She should speak, but not too sharply. She should desire, but not visibly enough to threaten innocence. She should mother, but not in a way the dominant culture cannot sentimentalize. She should endure, but not become angry at what she endures. If she is white, she may still be offered a version of protective sanctity, though often at the price of narrow scripts. If she is not white, the offer is usually thinner, more conditional, more fragile. These are not ancient laws in costume drama. They are living distributions of moral air. One of the most important modern conversations about race and gender has concerned the way black girls and women are read as less innocent, less childlike, more knowing, more sexually mature, more resilient, and, therefore, less deserving of protection. Whether in schools, policing, medicine, media, or everyday life. This perception has tangible consequences. It influences discipline, pain assessment, credibility, and empathy. We are no longer in the age of incantation bowls or demonological courts. Yet the old operation persists. A marked feminine body is interpreted in advance. Marmacy and terre, interpreted before evidence, interpreted before speech, interpreted before grief has even finished crossing the face. This is why the story we have traced is not antiquarian. It is diagnostic. It helps explain why certain women are still burdened with symbolism they did not choose. Why one woman's tears can mobilize institutions, while another woman's testimony must first fight through stereotype. Why family values rhetoric can still conceal unequal arrangements of labor and vulnerability. Why purity language, even when secularized, continues to sort bodies into the protectable and the exposed. The archive is not dead paper. It is trained feeling moving through living institutions. There is another dimension to this inheritance, the fragmentation of the feminine itself. When earlier worlds allowed a divine or symbolic feminine to carry multiplicity, love and anger, beauty and judgment, nurture and force, dissent and ascent, grief and sovereignty. Later, systems often translated that multiplicity into threat. Modern women inherit the debris of that translation. They are asked to be many things, but punished when the many things appear in the same body with too much coherence. The leader is suspected of coldness. The sensual woman is denied seriousness. The mother is denied authority outside care. The intellectual woman is denied softness. The strong woman is denied vulnerability. The vulnerable woman is denied competence. The angry woman is denied truth. The holy woman is denied flesh. The fleshly woman is denied holiness. This fragmentation is one of demonization's most intimate afterlives. It teaches women that wholeness itself may be socially costly. And because wholeness is costly, many people learn to survive by partition. One self for the workplace, one for family, one for church, one for danger, one for performance, one for silence. These partitions can be adaptive, they can save lives, but they also reveal the depth of the system that made partition necessary. If the divine feminine means anything useful in a serious historical conversation, perhaps it is not a vague mystical slogan, perhaps it is the memory of unpartitioned significance, the memory that feminine being was once imaginable, at least symbolically, as more than a narrow moral function, not always liberatory, not always equal, but larger, less reduced, less administratively tidy. That memory can be distorted, romanticized, commercialized, or turned into fantasy. We should guard against that. Yet the hunger beneath it is telling. People reach for lost images of sacred womanhood because they can feel how much modern systems have demanded reduction. Reduction into type, reduction into role, reduction into color, reduction into service, reduction into warning, reduction into respectable invisibility. And the reduction is never merely symbolic. It affects wages, safety, healthcare, legal standing, educational expectations, political representation, and bodily survival. This is why the history of demonizing the feminine cannot be quarantined inside religion or literature. It belongs to social analysis. It belongs to political history. It belongs to the study of race, labor, medicine, law, and media. It belongs wherever human beings decide whose complexity will be honored and whose complexity will be punished. There is no clean ending here. Systems decay unevenly. Some laws fall quickly while feelings linger. Some stereotypes lose their names while keeping their function. Some women gain visibility without safety. Some institutions learn the language of equality while preserving old reflexes in daily practice. If anything, modern life adds new speed to old divisions. Images move faster. Stereotypes circulate wider. The market commodifies rebellion and sells it back as style. Social media can both expose injustice and intensify the sorting of women into approved and condemned categories. The vocabulary changes. The reward system does not always change with it. So when we ask what survived the road from Sumer to Jim Crow, one answer is this: the habit of making women carry civilization's contradictions. If a culture wants beauty, nurture, labor, erotic charge, reproduction, moral authority, and social stability all at once, but refuses to redistribute power honestly, it will often place the contradiction inside women and then punish them for failing to resolve it. This is not only misogyny, it is social cowardice, and it has taken many masks: spirit, temptress, witch, savage woman, impure woman, unfit mother, fast girl, bad woman, illegible witness. Each term belongs to a specific time and place, yet each performs the same underlying labor. It turns a structural problem into a feminine one. That is why these stories are so durable. They are cheaper than justice. Every system that narrows human beings eventually creates its own counter-memory. People remember against it, sometimes in books, sometimes in kitchens, sometimes in prayer meetings, songs, family sayings, morning rituals, folklore, and secret comparisons no archive fully captures. Sometimes the memory is not even verbal. It is a gesture of dignity under insult, a refusal to laugh at the joke that is supposed to teach rank, a mother insisting on ceremony around her child in a world that treats that child as disposable, a woman carrying herself as though she has already decided the categories offered to her are too small. Resistance often begins there, long before it becomes theory. And theory matters too. Black women thinkers, organizers, teachers, preachers, club leaders, journalists, artists, and activists in the 19th and 20th centuries did more than ask for inclusion inside existing ideals. Many of them exposed the ideals themselves as racially selective and morally fraudulent. They understood that a society which adored white womanhood while violating black women had not merely failed to apply its values consistently. It had built its values through exclusion. That insight changes everything, because once exclusion is recognized as structural, The task is no longer simply to prove that marginalized women are respectable according to dominant standards, though strategic respectability politics often had practical necessity. The deeper task becomes to challenge the distribution of sacredness itself, to insist that tenderness, innocence, authority, intelligence, grief, motherhood, sexuality, and moral depth do not belong to one race, one class, or one approved script of femininity. This is where counter-memory becomes counter-world-making. Think of the women who exposed lynching not as isolated barbarity, but as a political instrument. Think of the women who defended black girlhood against premature adultification. Think of the women who created schools, mutual aid societies, clubs, churches, and print cultures in which black womanhood could appear not as stereotype, but as a center of thought. Think of the mothers who sustained family continuity against the aftershocks of sale, migration, debt peonage, domestic exploitation, and legal segregation. Think of the artists who kept complexity alive in image, voice, and narrative long after the public sphere had tried to flatten it. These women were not merely adding themselves to history, they were correcting the moral geometry of the world. And yet resistance is rarely pure. It often has to bargain with the terms of the age. Some reform movements answered racist sexual stereotypes by emphasizing chastity, domestic virtue, and disciplined respectability. That was understandable. When a culture insists on reading you as impure, the strategic assertion of purity can save lives, build institutions, and protect communities. But even this strategy shows how strong the old field remained. One had to negotiate with the grammar of purity because the grammar still governed the public ear. In other words, even refusal often begins inside the language imposed by power. That is not failure, it is history. At the same time, there were always broader, spiritual, and artistic refusals that reached beyond respectability into something more spacious. Sacred music, visionary religion, womanist thought, black, feminist critique, anti-colonial theology, and various forms of cultural reclamation all challenged the idea that legitimacy had to mean proximity to the narrow white script of ladyhood. Some reclaimed the body, some reclaimed anger, some reclaimed ancestral memory, some reclaimed divine imagery expansive enough to hold sorrow, sexuality, work, wisdom, and struggle together without splitting them into approved and condemned halves. Here we should take care not to force all liberatory traditions into one mystical category called the divine feminine. Not everyone uses that language, and sometimes the phrase becomes commercially vague, but the underlying desire is intelligible. To recover forms of value not built on reduction. To recover ways of imagining feminine life that are not exhausted by purity tests, racial ranking, service, or suspicion. This recovery does not require inventing a fantasy golden age. It requires honesty. Honesty that ancient societies were unequal. Honesty that religious traditions contain both wounds and resources. Honesty that the sacred can be weaponized. Honesty that modern institutions often carry old myths in secular dress. Honesty that resistance itself can inherit scars from the systems it opposes. And honesty that something more than policy is at stake. Civilization's imagination of womanhood shapes the emotional possibilities of justice. If women are imagined only as vessels of temptation, then justice becomes suspicious. If women are imagined only as innocent dependents, then justice becomes eternal. If some women are imagined as beyond innocence altogether, then justice becomes selective. But if women are imagined as full moral subjects, desiring, thinking, grieving, governing, creating, resisting, nurturing, erring, forgiving, and judging, then justice has to widen. That widening is one of the great unfinished tasks of modern life. Counter-memory also changes how we read the past. Instead of asking only when the feminine was first demonized, we begin asking who benefited from each stage of the narrowing, who gained from splitting womanhood into pure and impure, who gained from associating authority with masculinity and contamination with certain kinds of female embodiment, who gained from making white women the sanctified center and black women the exposed margin, who gained from converting social anxiety into stories about dangerous bodies. When we ask those questions, the pattern becomes harder to sentimentalize. The demonized feminine is not just a tragic literary motif, it is political labor. It keeps property legible, it keeps hierarchy emotional, it keeps violence narratable as care, it keeps the center feeling innocent. And because it does this work so efficiently, it is repeatedly reinvented. This means that the return of complexity, the refusal to reduce women to social functions, will always look threatening to systems built on simplification. A woman who insists on being multiple is difficult to classify. A community that refuses the script of contamination is difficult to discipline. A people who remember that the sacred does not belong exclusively to power are difficult to govern through shame alone. That difficulty is hopeful, not because history suddenly reverses, but because every structure of reduction is vulnerable at the point where the reduced speak beyond their assigned role. An enslaved woman testifies. A black journalist names the lie beneath white purity. A domestic worker keeps an archive in memory. A preacher reinterprets the tradition from below. A scholar traces the genealogy of stereotype. An artist paints grief without apology. A girl refuses the category waiting for her. Each act is small against the system. Together they alter the weather, and weather matters, because systems survive partly by making their climate feel eternal. When the climate changes, when people start hearing certain jokes as evidence, certain laws as moral absurdity, certain ideals as exclusionary, certain silences as violence, the structure begins to lose its spell. It may remain powerful, it may retaliate, but it no longer possesses the unquestioned naturalness that once protected it. This is why historical analysis is not an academic luxury here. It is one form of weather change. To name a pattern is to loosen its inevitability. To show that a category was made is to reveal that it can be unmade. To trace the route from myth to law is to interrupt the lie, that law simply reflects nature, and once that interruption happens, another possibility emerges. Not a return to ancient Sumer, not an escape into vague spirituality, not a denial of difference or history. Something harder. A world willing to let feminine life be more than one thing at once. A world willing to honor motherhood without imprisoning women inside it. A world willing to acknowledge desire without translating desire into guilt or stigma along racial lines. A world willing to hear female anger as intelligence under pressure. A world willing to treat black girls as girls, black women as women, and all women as persons rather than symbols for someone else's order. That world is unfinished, but unfinished is not the same as impossible. History has taught us how the narrowing happened. Counter-memory teaches us that narrowing is not destiny. If there is one word that echoes through every chamber we have visited tonight, it is protection. Protection of infants from the night spirit. Protection of the household from seduction and disorder. Protection of the soul from temptation. Protection of the village from hidden malice. Protection of civilization from pagan excess. Protection of white womanhood from black proximity. Protection of public morals from contamination. The vocabulary changes. The music is the same. And that should make us suspicious, because protection is one of the easiest moral languages to weaponize. It feels generous. It sounds reluctant. It allows power to imagine itself as service. It turns coercion into care. It lets a system say, we are not punishing, we are preserving, we are not dominating, we are defending. We are not inventing a hierarchy, we are guarding what makes community possible. But when we inspect the history, protection is rarely distributed evenly. Some are protected by being enclosed, some are protected by being obeyed, some are protected in theory and sacrificed in practice. Some are never protected at all, only managed. And often the people who most loudly proclaim protection are the very ones benefiting from the arrangement that produces the danger. This is why the demonization of the feminine so often hides inside paternal language. The feminine is marked as vulnerable or dangerous, depending on what the system needs. If a woman can lend sanctity to the order, she is exalted. If she unsettles the order, she is suspect. If she can absorb labor without social elevation, she is made sturdy. If she can serve as the emblem of the order's innocence, she is made fragile. Either way, A symbolic role serves the structure first. That is not protection. That is management draped in affection. We can see this with particular force in the long afterlife of the white, feminine ideal in the United States. White women were certainly constrained by patriarchal norms, and many suffered under them. Yet, white womanhood also functioned as racial capital. It could summon legal concern, public sentiment, and moral panic in ways denied to black women. Even its constraints became politically meaningful because the system treated white female vulnerability as socially sacred. The pedestal was a cage, yes, but it was also a weapon when contrasted with women outside the pedestal. This double truth is important. Not every beneficiary of a structure designed the structure. Not every constrained person stands outside power, and not every symbol of innocence is innocent in effect. These ambiguities make history morally difficult, which is one reason people prefer simpler stories. Yet simple stories are exactly what oppressive systems exploit. They thrive on tidy oppositions, pure and impure, civilized and savage, lady and whore, saint and witch, worthy, mother and unfit mother, protected child and prematurely adult body. The oppositions feel clarifying. In practice, they do the dirty work of distributing life chances. That distribution reaches into intimate territory, whose pregnancy is celebrated and whose is judged, whose motherhood is framed as sacrifice, and whose as burden, whose beauty is idealized and whose is eroticized into threat, whose grief is individualized and whose is treated as social noise, whose voice sounds like testimony and whose sounds like attitude. A society does not have to write these answers down in one legal code to make them real. It only has to repeat them often enough that institutions start behaving as though they are facts. This is where the old spiritual story becomes indistinguishable from administration. The dangerous woman in the night and the racially marked woman in the courtroom may belong to different centuries, but both occupy the same structural position. They are the bodies around which society organizes its fear while denying the full humanity of the feared, and fear is a remarkable organizer. It simplifies, it dramatizes, it short-circuits curiosity. It makes surveillance feel prudent. It makes violence feel exceptional even when it is routine. It makes hierarchy feel like foresight. Fear also flatters the fearful. It tells them they are vigilant. It tells them they are guardians, not aggressors. This is one reason the demonization of the feminine can persist even among people who sincerely believe themselves kind. They are not consciously trying to harm women. They are trying to preserve a world they have been taught is delicate. The problem is that the delicacy of that world often depends on making some women absorb the strain. The false gospel of protection says someone must carry the danger so that the center can imagine itself safe. The history we have traced shows who is usually chosen, and when chosen bodies resist the assignment, when they speak, organize, desire, govern, theorize, or simply refuse shame, the structure experiences this as betrayal. Not because the women have become newly dangerous, but because they have exposed the terms of the protection racket. A protection racket, after all, does not merely promise safety, it decides who counts as the kind of person safety is for. This has everything to do with the so-called divine feminine. Not because ancient goddesses offer a simple political program, but because the suppression of feminine multiplicity makes protection easier to monopolize. If feminine life can only appear as innocence under guard, or danger under suspicion, then the social imagination remains impoverished. It cannot conceive of women as sovereign moral agents, whose complexity does not threaten order but enrich it. That poverty of imagination is costly. It impoverishes men too. It teaches them to approach intimacy through control, reverence through infantilization, and moral seriousness through distance from whatever has been coded feminine and unstable. It teaches them to fear dependency while expecting care, to idealize softness while refusing mutual vulnerability, to call women mysterious rather than confronting the systems that keep women divided into performances. Patriarchy does not only cage women, it underdevelops human relation. But the cost is not borne equally. Women carry the asymmetry in their bodies. Some carry it as overprotection, some as underprotection, some as service, some as sexual suspicion, some as compulsory strength, some as respectability pressure, some as the exhaustion of having to present innocence before receiving ordinary mercy. And all of this becomes more legible when we stop treating race and gender as separate lanes occasionally intersecting. In the history of the United States especially, they are braided from the start. White femininity helped organize racial order. Racial order helped define which femininities counted. The categories were co-produced. This is why the leap from ancient fear to Jim Crow is not as strange as it first appears. We are not claiming an uninterrupted chain of identical ideas. We are observing a recurring habit of civilization to stabilize itself by placing contradiction in feminized bodies and then distinguishing among those bodies along lines of value. The categories become more sophisticated over time. They acquire theology, law, medicine, race science, etiquette, and bureaucratic neutrality. But beneath the upgrades lies the same temptation, to make control feel moral by making women carry danger. That temptation is still with us. It appears whenever public debate treats women's bodies as symbolic battlefields for national virtue. It appears whenever racialized women are denied vulnerability and then blamed for lacking delicacy. It appears whenever motherhood is glorified while actual mothers are abandoned. It appears whenever institutions call their restrictions protective while ignoring the harms those restrictions impose. It appears whenever female anger is pathologized because it disrupts the emotional comfort of the center. It appears whenever a woman who cannot or will not fit the approved script is treated as evidence of social decline, and because it appears in familiar language, it often passes unnoticed. That is why history must slow us down. It teaches us to hear old music inside modern speech. It teaches us that a nation can talk about decency while preserving caste, that a church can talk about holiness while reproducing hierarchy, that a family can talk about love while assigning silence, that an empire can talk about rescue while devouring worlds. The false gospel of protection always has beautiful words. That is how it gets close enough to rule. After all this, we should ask the question directly. What exactly was so dangerous? Was it sexuality? Sometimes, but only certain kinds, in certain bodies, under certain legal meanings. Was it female authority? Often, but again, not universally. Some forms of female authority were tolerated when they stabilized the order. Was it motherhood? Only when motherhood threatened hierarchy or refused to remain sentimental. Was it sacred power? Only when sacred power could not be monopolized by approved institutions. So perhaps the most accurate answer is this. What the system feared was not women in the abstract, and not even femininity as such. What it feared was uncontained relation that could not be neatly owned, ranked, or purified. A woman who connected eros to authority, a mother who connected nurture to political claim, a black woman who connected suffering to testimony, a female body that connected law to hypocrisy, a sacred image that connected beauty to judgment rather than submission, a community of women who connected memory to resistance. What the system fears is not merely female power. It is female power that reveals interdependence without surrendering to hierarchy. That kind of power is difficult to govern because it exposes the lie at the center of domination, the lie that order is created only from the top down. In truth, every social order depends on care, reproduction, symbolic meaning, and emotional labor flowing through bodies it often refuses to honor. The hidden knowledge of women, especially marginalized women, is that society is much less self-sufficient than it pretends. Someone has always been carrying the water, tending the wounded, transmitting the songs, burying the dead, raising the children, preserving the memory, balancing the accounts of survival. When those same people ask for authority, the system panics, not because authority suddenly becomes dangerous, but because dependence becomes visible. This is one reason the demonized feminine so often appears at the threshold between life and death, purity and pollution, inside and outside, home and wilderness, nation and stranger, human and divine. Thresholds reveal dependency. They are places where categories touch, and systems that rest on hard divisions cannot tolerate too much. threshold intelligence. They need someone to embody the danger of the threshold so that everyone else can keep pretending the boundaries are stable. The night woman, the witch, the colonized temptress, the impure mother, the black woman outside the pedestal, all of them are carrying, in distorted form, society's anxiety about the places where life refuses neat separation. That refusal can look frightening. It can also look holy. Perhaps that is another way to understand what later ages tried so hard to narrow. The sacred feminine, where it appears in human imagination, often gathers together things hierarchy prefers to split: eros and reverence, creativity and destruction, grief and command, vulnerability and force, body and meaning, intimacy and authority. Such a figure can be terrifying, not because she is evil, but because she reveals that life itself is not cleanly partitioned. To encounter her is to confront the fact that order cannot survive by purity alone. It survives by relation, by debt, by dependence, by birth, by mortality, by the labor of those closest to what orderly societies most want to deny. Yeah, if that is true, then the long history of demonization begins to make even more sense. The divine feminine had to be reduced, not only because men feared women, though many did. It had to be reduced because large systems fear reminders of their own dependence. They fear anything that reveals the myth of autonomous control. They fear bodies that show where life comes from, where grief accumulates, where law fails, where purity cracks, where care exceeds permission, where meaning is made below the level of official doctrine. That fear explains why women's labor is so often romanticized and underpaid, why motherhood is praised and unsupported, why sexual purity is demanded and violence excused, why women of color are hypervisible as problems and invisible as centers of moral world-making, why institutions speak of family while extracting from the very people who make family livable. The reduction of the feminine, then, is not a narrow women's issue. It is a civilization's strategy for concealing the conditions of its own survival. And this strategy has a racial dimension because racial hierarchy needs selective dependency. It needs some people to perform care, labor, and reproduction without gaining corresponding symbolic authority. In the United States, black women have occupied that impossible position with particular force, indispensable to the making of households, cultures, economies, and movements, yet persistently denied the innocence, tenderness, and centrality that would force the nation to rearrange itself around their humanity. What the system feared in black women was never simply one thing. It feared witness. It feared endurance that would not become consent. It feared moral claim. It feared beauty not organized for white consumption. It feared grief that could become indictment. It feared sexuality that could not be contained within plantation, fantasy, or segregationist slander. It feared mothering that kept creating life under genocidal pressure. It feared thought. It feared memory. It feared comparison. Because comparison is deadly to innocent self-images. The moment a nation compares how it protects one woman and abandons another, its moral mythology begins to tremble. This is why historical consciousness matters so much. It teaches comparison. It makes us hold ancient fragment and modern statute in the same field of vision. It asks whether the same civilizational instincts are at work beneath very different surfaces. It does not claim that Sumer caused segregation. It claims something subtler and more disturbing, that human societies repeatedly rediscover the convenience of feminized danger, and that when race enters the formula, the hierarchy can become astonishingly durable. What then would it mean not simply to condemn that history, but to outgrow it? It would mean more than celebrating women in abstract terms, more than reviving goddess imagery as an aesthetic, more than diversifying representation while leaving the emotional economy intact. It would require changing what counts as socially intelligible authority. It would require widening the range of femininity that receives protection without demanding conformity. It would require ending the habit of reading black women as less innocent, less grievable, less tender, less central. It would require forms of spiritual and political life in which care is honored without becoming a chain, and authority is shared without being masculinized as the only credible shape of seriousness. Vadum stemerum. In short, It would require a society mature enough to stop turning its contradictions into women's burdens. That maturity is rare. Perhaps because it asks too much honesty. It asks men to confront the ways they were taught to need women while fearing women. It asks white women to confront the historical uses of their protected image. It asks institutions to admit that many of their moral categories were never neutral. It asks religious traditions to distinguish between holiness and control. It asks nations to see that innocence has often been a political allocation, not a universal recognition. And it asks all of us to live without the cheap comfort of simple villains and simple saints. That last request may be the hardest, because the divided woman is easier to manage than the whole one. The pure woman can be worshipped. The impure woman can be blamed. The whole woman has to be encountered. Encounter requires humility. Humility is precisely what systems of domination train us to avoid. So perhaps what the system feared all along was not only the feminine, it was humility before complexity, humility before dependence, humility before the fact that the sacred cannot be monopolized without violence. Once we say that aloud, the path from ancient temple to theological argument to witch trial to colonial mission to slave plantation to segregated railway carriage becomes less a bizarre collage than a single, long education in the costs of refusing that humility. And if it is an education, then perhaps it can also be unlearned. Let us go back to the beginning, back before the laws, before the sermons, before the newspapers, before the pseudoscience and the train cars and the county lines and the courtroom manners. Back to the first question in the first room: who gets to name the sacred and who gets named as danger so that others can feel sacred by comparison? That question has followed us the entire way. In ancient Sumer, the feminine could still appear in forms too large for later systems to comfortably manage: political, erotic, cosmic, violent, grieving, generative. Not a utopia, not a feminist republic before feminism, but a symbolic field in which womanhood had not yet been fully reduced to domestic moral function. Alongside that grandeur there were also shadows, night presences, anxieties attached to the threshold of home and body. The archive was mixed from the start. Then came the long work of narrowing. A warning becomes a type becomes a lesson becomes doctrine becomes atmosphere becomes law becomes inheritance. At each stage, the feminine is not simply erased, it is sorted, elevated here, suspected there, venerated under condition, demonized under pressure, used symbolically when useful, denied complexity when dangerous. That is why the story can feel contradictory. The same civilization that praises mothers can despise actual female power. The same culture that canonizes a woman can punish women who speak with authority. The same society that says it protects women can expose whole classes of women to relentless violation. Contradiction is not the system's failure. Contradiction is often its method. Because contradiction allows power to remain flexible, it can call women weak when it wants to exclude them, strong when it wants to exploit them, pure when it wants to sanctify hierarchy, impure when it wants to deny mercy. If one script stops working, another is available. The feminine is made into a repertoire of social management. That repertoire becomes especially brutal when race determines which script applies. A white woman may be constrained by ideals she did not choose, yet those same ideals can summon the law's concern. A black woman may be celebrated abstractly for strength, while being denied the softness, innocence, and public grief that would force society to protect her. An indigenous woman may be romanticized as earth, mystery, or tradition, while her actual political presence is marginalized. A poor woman may be praised for sacrifice, while the conditions demanding sacrifice remain untouched. And across all these positions, complexity is rationed. Some women are allowed contradiction because they are already recognized as fully human. Others are denied contradiction because contradiction itself would require the dominant order to feel too much. To feel too much is dangerous for hierarchy. Hierarchy prefers simplification. It prefers the good woman and the bad woman, the lady and the fallen woman, the saint and the seductress, the respectable mother and the irresponsible mother, the civilization-bearing woman and the contamination-bearing woman. But real women do not live there. Real women live in mixed weather. They love and rage. They nurture and judge. They desire and mourn. They carry history in their muscles. They belong to institutions and exceed them. They are made by stories and also break stories. They inherit wounds and invent languages. They survive categories that were never built to tell the truth about them. This is why the demonization of the divine feminine is not, in the end, only a story about religion or symbolism. It is a story about what happens when civilizations become frightened of mixed weather, when they demand purity where life offers complexity, when they demand hierarchy where life reveals dependency, when they demand one approved shape of womanhood while relying on innumerable women living far outside that shape to keep society functioning. Such civilizations become brittle. Brittleness is often mistaken for morality. It is not morality. It is fear that has forgotten its own name. That is the sentence I keep returning to as we walk back through this museum of stories and systems. Fear that has forgotten its own name. Not irrational fear in the sense of chaos, but disciplined fear. Fear arranged by theology. Fear polished by etiquette. Fear sanctified by law. Fear distributed through race. Fear so normalized that generations inherit it as intuition. And once intuition hardens, reform becomes difficult because the structure no longer appears constructed. It appears obvious, natural, traditional, necessary. That is why historical work matters, not because it produces instant innocence, but because it reintroduces contingency. It shows that categories were made by people under pressure. It shows that sacredness was allocated. It shows that stereotypes had functions. It shows that what many call human nature often has a very traceable administrative history. When we say that black womanhood was systematically denied the protections attached to white womanhood, we are not making a poetic claim, we are naming a political design. When we say that the feminine was split into holy and dangerous forms, we are not indulging metaphor. We are describing a durable strategy of governance. When we say that the divine feminine was demonized, we do not mean only that old goddesses fell from favor. We mean that whatever in feminine life exceeded tidy control, sexual autonomy, embodied knowledge, ritual, authority, threshold power, maternal claim, social memory, grief turned, public care linked to sovereignty, was repeatedly pressured into suspicion. That suspicion still has descendants, and yet descendants are not destiny. There is another inheritance available, the inheritance of women who kept complexity alive, women who prayed without surrendering judgment, women who mothered without consenting to erasure, women who worked in white homes while carrying private worlds the white home could neither measure nor master, women who named violence when society preferred decorum, women who held communities together in eras built to fragment them, women who were called too loud, too dark, too sexual, too hard, too intellectual, too demanding, too mystical, too angry, and kept speaking anyway. If the story of demonization teaches us how power narrows, the story of these women teaches us something equally important. Narrowing is never complete. There is always remainder. A song not fully captured, a memory not fully erased, a dignity not fully translated into the language of the dominant, a sacred excess that survives categorization. Perhaps that is the deepest reason systems keep returning to control. They sense the remainder. They know, even when they cannot say it, that life exceeds the scripts written for it. The dangerous feminine, in all her historical masks, is often nothing more than the name power gives to what it cannot fully absorb. And once you understand that, you begin to hear the accusation differently, not as truth, as confession. The system says this woman is dangerous. What it often means is, this woman reveals the terms of our order. The system says this body is impure. What it often means is, this body exposes the fiction of our purity. The system says this voice is excessive. What it often means is, this voice speaks beyond the script we prepared for it. The system says this motherhood is unfit. What it often means is, this motherhood asks us to treat the margin as the center. These are not the same thing. The confusion between them has shaped centuries, and recognizing that confusion may be the first small act of freedom. Epilogue. the last light in the gallery. So now the gallery is nearly dark. We have walked from temple city to scripture margin, from scripture margin to theological split, from split to accusation, from accusation to procedure, from procedure to empire, from empire to plantation, from plantation to segregation, and from segregation into the afterlives, still moving through the present. Along the way, we have not discovered one hidden master story that explains everything. History is too unruly for that, but we have found a pressure, a repeated shaping force, a recognizable strategy by which cultures under strain convert feminine complexity into social danger and then convert that danger into governance. That strategy survives because it is adaptive. When a civilization wants continuity, it can idealize a narrow form of womanhood and call it virtue. When it wants obedience, it can punish deviation and call it protection. When it wants labor, it can naturalize women's service and call it love. When it wants racial hierarchy, it can reserve purity for some women and suspicion for others and call the arrangement common sense. When it wants to hide exploitation, it can translate dependence into mythology. And because mythology feels older than argument, people obey it even when no one says the old words aloud. That is the real power of demonization. It does not only produce hatred, it produces instinct. Hatred can be challenged by evidence. Instinct is harder because it calls itself realism. It says, of course this woman sounds credible and that one sounds aggressive. Of course this mother deserves support and that one deserves scrutiny. Of course this body is to be cherished and that one to be managed. Of course this anger is principled and that anger is dangerous. Of course this sexuality is romantic and that sexuality is vulgar. Of course this femininity is civilized and that femininity is too much. Whenever a culture begins speaking in such obviousness, history should make us nervous, because obviousness is often where old violence hides best. The deeper tragedy is that demonization does not only injure the women it marks, it impoverishes collective imagination. It narrows the kinds of tenderness men can practice without control. It narrows the kinds of authority communities can recognize without fear. It narrows the kinds of spirituality religious traditions can sustain without hierarchy. It narrows the very meaning of relation by teaching people to value order more than truth about dependence. A society trained to fear feminine complexity will often fear complexity everywhere. It will fear mixed identity. It will fear porous boundaries. It will fear embodied knowledge. It will fear grief that will not stay private. It will fear care that turns into demand. It will fear the testimony of those whose lives reveal what the official story excludes. This is one reason Black women have so often been central to transformative politics, not because suffering makes anyone automatically wise, but because standing at the crossing of so many denials can produce a clarity about how the system works. A person forced outside the protected center may see the center more accurately than those comforted by it. A woman denied innocence may hear the politics of innocence more sharply. A community required to survive without guaranteed protection may understand the fiction of protection better than those still entranced by it. That insight is costly. It is purchased in generations of underprotection, labor, witness, endurance, improvisation, and refusal. It should not have been necessary, and yet it has become one of the great moral archives of the modern world. If we are honest, this is also why the figure of the demonized woman remains so culturally magnetic. She is not only feared, she is fascinating because she gathers what the center has exiled from itself. She carries appetite that official virtue disowns, knowledge that credentialed authority cannot easily absorb, anger that politeness has suppressed, grief that public order cannot metabolize, historical memory that innocence would rather forget. The dangerous woman is often where a civilization stores the truths it cannot tell straightforwardly about its own foundations. In that sense, demonization is a distorted archive. It records in negative form what power most urgently needed to manage. Why does the witch recur? Because female knowledge remains socially consequential. Why does the temptress recur? Because desire remained destabilizing to ordered hierarchies. Why does the impure mother recur? Because reproduction remained political. Why does the racialized dangerous woman recur? Because whiteness required contrast to feel pure. Why does the shrill or excessive woman recur? Because female speech remained capable of naming what the structure denied. Power is often most revealing in the shape of its panic. This is why the line from Sumer to Jim Crow, although not straight, is meaningful. It is a line of recurring panic. Different institutions, different cosmologies, different economic worlds, different kinds of texts and laws. But again and again, under conditions of instability or ambition, societies discover that the feminine can be made to bear contradiction for them. The cost of that convenience is then paid not only by women in general, but especially by women whose race, class, labor, or social position places them outside the protected image of respectable civilization. That is the narrowing, and the narrowing leaves marks. It marks bodies with expectation. It marks families with differential grief. It marks institutions with unequal listening. It marks language with inherited suspicion. It marks theology with control disguised as care. It marks the law with the residue of old myths. Sometimes people hear an argument like this and worry that it dissolves all moral distinction, as though acknowledging the historical construction of purity and danger means every norm is arbitrary. But that is not what this story says. It does not say order is fake, or that all boundaries are violence, or that every tradition is nothing but domination. It says something harder, that when boundaries and traditions are built without humility about power, they repeatedly draft women into symbolic labor that exceeds justice. The answer is not the absence of all form. The answer is forms honest enough to know whom they have historically burdened. Humility again. It returns at the end because it was missing at the beginning. Humility about the body, humility about dependence, humility about the fact that care, birth, mourning, and vulnerability are not lower realities beneath political life. They are political life in one of its deepest forms. Humility about race, especially in societies that built dignity unevenly and then called the arrangement natural. Humility about how easily the sacred is appropriated by power. Without that humility, even noble ideals become dangerous. Protection becomes control. Purity becomes exclusion. Civilization becomes caste. Tradition becomes selective memory. Womanhood becomes a sorting mechanism, and God, or morality, or nature, whatever language the system prefers, becomes the seal pressed into wax over arrangements men do not want to admit they made. This is why the end of our journey cannot simply be outrage, though. Outrage has its place. Outrage alone keeps us at the level of accusation. What this history asks for is discernment, the patience to ask whenever a society identifies a dangerous woman, a contaminated body, an unfit mother, a threatening sexuality, an uncivilized femininity. What labor is this image doing? What fear is being organized? What hierarchy is being sanctified? Whose vulnerability is being protected and whose is being spent? Those questions do not solve everything, but they prevent innocence from becoming lazy. And perhaps that is the beginning of wisdom. In the quiet after such questions, another possibility becomes faintly visible. Not a world beyond conflict, and not a world in which the feminine is romanticized into moral perfection. That would simply invert one falsehood into another. What becomes visible instead is a world where no group of women has to carry contradiction for the comfort of the whole. A world where authority and care are not segregated into gendered castes. A world where black womanhood is not asked to be invulnerable before it is believed. A world where spiritual seriousness does not require fear of the body. A world where memory is not punished for exposing who paid for order. Such a world would feel unfamiliar to many of the systems we have studied. Perhaps that is why it still feels unfinished. And yet unfinished things can still be real. A freedom not fully won can still be practiced. A sacredness not evenly recognized can still be insisted upon. A complexity not yet socially comfortable can still be lived. That may be the final lesson. Not that the divine feminine was once whole and history shattered her forever, but that every age must decide whether it will meet feminine complexity with humility or with control. Every age must decide whether it will let women be subjects or require them to remain symbols. Every age must decide whose bodies will bear its anxieties and whose bodies will be sheltered from them. Every age must decide whether purity is a path to justice or an alibi for exclusion. And every age leaves its answer in the lives of women. When future generations want to know what a civilization truly worshipped, they may not need to begin with its creeds. They can begin with the women it protected, the women it used, the women it feared, and the women it refused to fully see. There, more clearly than in any monument, the moral architecture appears. So if we leave this gallery with anything tonight, let it be this: the demonization of the feminine was never only about women. It was about power trying to make its fears look holy. It was about societies trying to turn dependence into hierarchy, complexity into warning, and exploitation into order. It was about deciding, again and again, that some women would stand in for chaos so that others could stand in for civilization. And from ancient Sumer to Jim Crow, that decision shaped myths, rituals, households, laws, empires, labor systems, moral vocabularies, and the inner weather of millions of lives. The names changed, the costumes changed, the scriptures and statutes changed, but the temptation remained. To call control protection, to call hierarchy nature, to call exclusion purity, to call women dangerous when they revealed too much. That is the old temptation, and perhaps the beginning of justice is simply this: refusing to inherit it unquestioned. Because the last light in the gallery does not fall on the demon, it falls on the hand that painted her. Coda, what to hear when the accusation returns. Before we leave, there is one final discipline this history asks of us. It asks us to listen differently the next time a culture begins to panic about women in the language of order. The next time public speech tells us that a certain kind of woman is too loud, too sexual, too fertile, too angry, too educated, too unfeminine, too masculine, too mystical, too ambitious, too unmotherly, too indulgent, too visible, too political, too difficult to classify. The next time a nation tells us that its future depends on controlling women's bodies for their own good. The next time a religious movement treats women as sacred only insofar as they remain symbol rather than subject. The next time commentators describe one group of girls as innocent and another group as naturally worldly. The next time grief from the margin is treated as agitation, while grief at the center is treated as tragedy. The next time a community discovers, yet again, that the easiest way to quiet its anxieties is to concentrate them in feminine form. When that happens, history tells us not to be mesmerized by the novelty of the language. The language is always new. The operation is usually old. Ask what contradiction is being relocated. Ask what dependency is being hidden. Ask whose body is being asked to store social panic. Ask whose protection is being enlarged and whose is being thinned. Ask which women are being split from the category of the fully grievable, the fully innocent, the fully complex, the fully sacred. And ask, above all, what order is being defended so frantically that it requires this much symbolic labor from women. Those questions do not emerge from cynicism. They emerge from fidelity to reality. They are what responsible moral memory sounds like after innocence has been educated by history. Perhaps that is what maturity means in the end. Not the loss of ideals, but the refusal to let ideals float free of their social cost. A maturer society can still honor fidelity, family, holiness, and care, but it must honor them honestly, without building those goods on the reduction of some women for the protection of others. A mature faith can still speak of purity, but only if purity no longer functions as a caste boundary. A mature politics can still speak of safety, but only if safety is not allocated according to race, class, and usefulness. A mature culture can still celebrate motherhood, but only if mothers are not praised as symbols while abandoned as persons. That kind of maturity is difficult because it threatens every cheap arrangement. It threatens the easy joke, the easy stereotype, the easy courtroom assumption, the easy sermon, the easy campaign speech, the easy cinematic shorthand, the easy policy that claims to protect while actually containing. We live among those easies, and that means the old story is never as far away as we think. Somewhere, even now, a familiar script is being prepared. A complicated woman is being translated into a warning. A racialized girl is being read as older than she is. A mother is being judged by standards designed without support for her life. A female voice is being heard as tone before it is heard as thought. A sacred symbol is being used to discipline actual bodies. A nation is telling itself that order requires somebody else's burden. When you have seen the pattern, these scenes stop looking isolated. They begin to rhyme. That is not cause for despair. It is cause for vigilance. Vigilance, not the vigilance of the fearful, but the vigilance of the honest. The vigilance that notices when reverence curdles into control. The vigilance that notices when a law's beneficiaries are different from the people it claims to protect. The vigilance that notices when the center's innocence depends on the margin's exposure. The vigilance that notices when a woman is being turned into a symbol because no one wants to confront the structure around her. This vigilance is not only political, it is intimate. It changes how we raise children, how we read scripture, how we teach history, how we hear women in pain, how we hear women in authority, how we assign softness, how we assign threat, how we respond when a girl, a mother, a worker, a widow, a scholar, a preacher, or a protester refuses the role prepared for her. In each of these moments, the old archive whispers. The question is whether we obey it, and perhaps that is where the journey from Sumer to Jim Crow finally arrives. Not in a lecture hall, not in an archive box, not even in a courtroom, but in the instant before interpretation hardens, in that human interval where we decide whether to see a woman as a person or as a solution to our fear, whether to hear complexity as intelligence or as threat, whether to meet the threshold with humility or to paint another demon and call the painting wisdom. History cannot make that decision for us. It can only strip away excuses. It can show that the painting has been done before. It can show what the painting cost. It can show how many generations were asked to live inside its frame. And it can remind us that every time a society paints a demon onto feminine complexity, it tells us less about women than about the fear hidden in its own design. That may be the final reversal in this entire story. The dangerous woman is not always the revelation of female threat. Very often, she is the revelation of institutional insecurity. The impure woman is not always the exposure of moral collapse. Very often, she is the exposure of purity as a political allocation. The excessive woman is not always the sign that order is failing. Very often, she is the sign that order required too much silence from the start. The unfit mother is not always proof of private deficiency. Very often, she is evidence of a society that praises care while starving its caretakers. And the woman called dangerous because she crosses boundaries may be dangerous in only one sense that matters to unjust systems. She makes the boundary visible. That is why such systems keep trying to return her to shadow. But shadows are never complete. Some names survive. Some stories survive. Some songs survive. Some daughters survive with a clearer ear than the system expected. And sometimes, after centuries of warnings, a culture begins at last to recognize the accusation for what it was, not revelation, but strategy. If that recognition takes hold, even partially, then perhaps all these rooms we have passed through do more than burden us. Perhaps they tutor us. They teach us how fear becomes institution, how institution becomes common sense, how common sense becomes character, and how character, once examined, can begin to change. That change is slow. It may not look dramatic. It may begin in scholarship, in testimony, in teaching, in the rereading of old texts, in the honoring of girls, in the widening of empathy, in the refusal to let one kind of woman stand for purity while another stands for danger. It may begin in the decision to stop asking women to carry the contradictions of worlds they did not design. That decision would not repair everything, but it would alter the moral weather. And sometimes history turns when the weather changes. So we end where the whole journey began, before a set of stories trying to decide what kind of light they cast. Some stories illuminate, some only dazzle. Some are lanterns carried by the frightened, useful but distorting. And some are mirrors painted over so many times that the face beneath them disappears. The history of the demonized feminine contains all three. It contains genuine fear, strategic distortion, and the remnants of truths too powerful to be comfortably kept. Our task is not to flatten them into one moral slogan. Our task is to see clearly enough that the next painted demon does not pass for destiny. And if we can do that, if we can look at the accusation and ask whose order it serves, whose fear it shelters, whose humanity it discounts, then perhaps the old spell weakens, not all at once, but enough for another story to breathe. Postscript, a final measure. And perhaps one final measure can help us test whether we have really understood the journey. When a culture speaks about women, does it leave them enough room to be human? Enough room to be contradictory without becoming suspect? Enough room to be wounded without becoming weak? Enough room to be strong without becoming inhuman? Enough room to be sexual without becoming disposable? Enough room to be maternal without disappearing inside service? Enough room to be intellectual without being exiled from softness? Enough room to be holy without being trapped in purity? Enough room to be angry without being stripped of credibility? Enough room to be vulnerable without being denied authority? If the answer is no, then however modern the institutions may look, however polished the language may sound, some part of the old narrowing is still at work. That is the measure, not whether a society praises women in the abstract. Many societies do that, not whether it produces a few exceptional female symbols. Many societies do that too. The measure is whether ordinary women across lines of race and class are allowed the complexity that power historically reserved for itself. Can they be more than function, more than warning, more than emblem, more than vessel, more than proof of another person's virtue, more than the screen onto which public anxiety is projected? That question brings us, quietly, back to the old figures with which we began. The ancient goddess too immense for later comfort, the knight figure burdened with household fear, the saint permitted sanctity under obedience, the witch made visible as treason, the colonized woman judged as civilizational evidence, the enslaved woman used without innocence, the segregated woman forced to labor beneath the halo she could never wear. They are not the same figure, but they have all been asked, in one way or another, to hold more social contradiction than any person should be asked to bear. If we want another future, that assignment has to end, and it ends first in recognition. Recognition that the accusation is often inherited, recognition that the stereotype has a job, recognition that the protected ideal and the abandoned woman are born from the same architecture, recognition that the sacred, once monopolized by power, stops being a refuge and becomes a sorting device, recognition that what looks like female danger is often unresolved fear about relation, dependence, and justice. These recognitions are not dramatic. They do not sound like revolution, but they change what a person can no longer pretend not to know. And that may be where the longest histories finally matter most. Not in giving us one perfect conclusion, but in removing the comfort of innocent misreading. Once you have seen how often control disguised itself as protection, how often purity disguised itself as exclusion, how often moral order demanded a scapegoated femininity, the old stories lose some of their power to enchant. You can still hear them, but now you can hear the hand behind the voice. And when you can hear the hand behind the voice, the future becomes at least slightly less obedient to the past. And maybe that is enough to begin. To hear the old accusation, trace the fear beneath it, and refuse to let another generation mistake strategy for truth.